the iron horse that brought Zelda Martinson across 2,000 miles of prairie and mountain, had carried her all the way to Paso Robles, California, only to abandon her at the end of September in 1883, when the station master nailed a weathered board across the depot door and told her the line was shutting down for good. She stood on the platform with her 2 traveling trunks and a carpet bag, watching the last wisps of steam fade into the golden afternoon light, and tried not to let the panic crawling up her throat show on her face. The letter from her aunt had promised a teaching position at the schoolhouse and a place to stay, but Aunt Margaret had been dead 3 weeks according to the telegram the station master handed her with apologetic eyes, and now there was no train to carry her back east, no money for stage fare, and the sun was already dipping toward the coastal hills. "Miss, you cannot stay here," the station master said, pulling his cap lower over his thinning hair. "The railroad is pulling out completely. No more trains, no more depot. I have got my own family to think about, heading to San Francisco tomorrow morning." Zelda smoothed her traveling dress, navy blue with modest buttons up to her collar, and tried to think past the roaring in her ears. She was 22 years old, had left Philadelphia with every cent she owned sewn into the lining of her second-best coat, and now stood in a town where she knew no one, with nowhere to go and night coming on fast. The platform was already empty except for her and the station master, the small town of Paso Robles spreading out in dusty streets lined with wooden buildings that looked sun-bleached and tired. "Is there a boarding house?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "There was," the station master said. "Mrs. Chen ran one, but she closed it last month when the rumors started about the railroad pulling out. Most folks who had the means have already left. The cattle business is not what it used to be around here, and without the train, well." He shrugged helplessly. "You might try the hotel, but I will tell you honest, miss, it is not a proper place for a lady alone." Zelda looked down the main street where a few buildings still showed signs of life. A saloon with painted letters on the window, a general store with a crooked awning. What might have been a church at the far end of the street. The hotel the station master mentioned was a 2-story structure that leaned slightly to one side, with a sign that read Paso Robles Hotel in faded red paint. "Thank you," she said quietly, because there was nothing else to say. The station master touched his cap, picked up his own worn satchel, and headed down the street without looking back. Within minutes, Zelda was alone on the platform, the September sun painting everything the color of honey and dust. She sat down on the larger of her 2 trunks and tried to think. The teaching position was gone with Aunt Margaret. Her return ticket was worthless with the railroad shut down. The money she had left would not last more than a week or 2 at most. She could write to her brother in Philadelphia, but a letter would take weeks each way, and she could not survive that long without help. The realization settled over her like a cold blanket despite the warmth of the California afternoon. The sound of wagon wheels on packed earth made her look up. A man was driving a buckboard down the main street, pulled by 2 sturdy horses that looked like they had seen hard work but were well cared for. The man himself was lean and weathered, probably in his mid-20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a battered hat pulled low against the sun. He wore denims and a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and there was something careful about the way he handled the reins, like a man who paid attention to details. The wagon rolled past the depot, and Zelda thought that was the end of it, but then the man pulled the horses to a stop and looked back over his shoulder. For a long moment, he just sat there, and Zelda could feel his gaze even though she could not quite see his face under the brim of his hat. Then he turned the wagon around with practiced ease and drove back to the platform. "Depot is closed," he said, and his voice was low and rough like he did not use it much. "I know," Zelda said, standing up and brushing the dust from her skirt. "The station master just informed me." The man pushed his hat back, and she got her first clear look at his face. He was younger than she had initially thought, maybe 25 or 26, with sun-darkened skin and gray eyes that looked almost colorless in the slanting light. There was a scar along his jaw, white against the tan, and his expression was guarded in a way that spoke of a man who had learned not to trust easily. "You waiting for someone?" he asked. "I was waiting for my aunt," Zelda said, and heard her voice waver just slightly. She cleared her throat and continued more firmly. "She passed away 3 weeks ago. I only just found out." The man looked at her trunks, then back at her face. Something shifted in his expression, though she could not have named what it was. "You have got nowhere to go." It was not a question, but Zelda answered anyway. "The station master suggested the hotel." "The hotel is no place for a woman alone," the man said flatly. "Half the rooms are rented by the month to drifters and gamblers. The other half are rented by the hour, if you understand my meaning." Heat flooded Zelda's cheeks, but she kept her chin up. "Then I suppose I will have to make other arrangements." "What other arrangements?" The man's tone was not unkind, just pragmatic. "The boarding house is closed." The next town with a proper hotel is San Luis Obispo, 25 miles south, and the stage only runs twice a week. Next one is not until Friday, and that is 4 days from now. "I will manage," Zelda said, though she had no idea how. The man studied her for another long moment, then seemed to come to some decision. He set the brake on the wagon and climbed down, moving with an easy grace that spoke of strength held in check. Up close, he was taller than she had realized, probably just over 6 feet, and there was something solid about him, like a man who could be counted on to finish what he started. "My name is Dalton Merrick," he said. "I've got a ranch about 5 miles west of here, up in the hills. It is not much, just me and my foreman and about 200 head of cattle, but there is a guest room in the main house that nobody is using. You could stay there until you figure out what you are doing next." Zelda stared at him. "You are inviting me, a complete stranger, to stay at your ranch." "I am offering you a safe place to sleep," Dalton said. "You can keep the door locked if it makes you feel better. My foreman's wife, Maria, comes in 3 times a week to do the cooking and cleaning. She will be there tomorrow morning. You will not be alone with just me if that is what worries you." "Why would you help me?" Zelda asked, because in her experience no one did something for nothing. Dalton looked away, out toward the hills that were turning purple in the fading light. "My sister got stranded in a town in Nevada 2 years ago when the stage company went bankrupt. Some rancher and his wife took her in, kept her safe until my brother could get there to bring her home. I figure I owe the world one in return." It was the most he had said since stopping, and Zelda heard the truth in his words. She looked at her trunks, at the closed depot, at the empty street where shadows were already pooling in the doorways. She thought about the hotel that was no place for a lady, about sleeping in the depot with no lock on the door, about trying to make 4 days' worth of money last when she barely had 4 days' worth to begin with. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you. I accept your offer." Dalton nodded once, as if that settled it, and bent to pick up her larger trunk. He hefted it into the back of the wagon like it weighed nothing, then grabbed the second trunk while Zelda gathered her carpet bag. Within minutes, her belongings were loaded and Dalton was helping her up onto the wagon seat, his hand firm and calloused and oddly reassuring under her elbow. He climbed up beside her, released the brake, and clicked his tongue at the horses. The wagon rolled forward, leaving the closed depot behind, and Zelda tried not to think about how she was heading into the unknown with a man she had met 5 minutes ago. but his hands were steady on the reins, and he had not looked at her with anything other than straightforward practicality. And she had the sense that Dalton Merrick was exactly what he appeared to be, a rancher who saw someone in need and decided to help. They rode in silence for the first mile, the wagon following a rutted track that led away from town and up into the Golden Hills. The landscape was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, all dry grass and scattered oak trees with twisted branches that reached toward the sky. In the distance, Zelda could see the dark line of mountains, and beyond them, she knew, was the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, though she had never seen it. "How long were you planning to stay with your aunt?" Dalton asked after a while, breaking the silence. "Indefinitely," Zelda said. "She had arranged a teaching position for me at the schoolhouse. I was to live with her and help with expenses. You are a teacher. I am trained as one. I taught for 2 years at a girls' academy in Philadelphia before the headmistress decided to hire her niece for my position." The bitterness in her voice surprised her, but Dalton just nodded as if he understood how the world worked. "Paso Robles still has a schoolhouse," he said. "I do not know if they have a teacher, though. The last one left when the railroad announced it was pulling out." "Do you think they might hire me?" Dalton glanced at her, his gray eyes thoughtful. "Possibly. But I will tell you straight, the town is dying. Most of the families with children have already moved on. There might be 15, 20 students left, if that. And the school board is not going to want to pay much if they can pay at all." "I see." Zelda looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. "Then I suppose I will need to find another town, another position." "There is work in San Luis Obispo," Dalton said. "And San Francisco, if you want to go that far. But you would need money for the stage and for boarding until you found a position." "How much would the stage to San Luis Obispo cost?" $2. Zelda did a quick calculation in her head. She had $8.30 left after buying her train ticket east and paying for meals along the way. $2 for the stage, and she would need at least another $1 for a room while she looked for work, and food on top of that. It would be close, very close, and if she did not find a position quickly, she would be stranded again. "I will pay you for the room and board," she said, lifting her chin. "I do not want charity." "I am not asking for payment," Dalton said. "But if it makes you feel better, Maria could use help with the cooking and cleaning. The ranch is small, but it is still more work than one woman can handle 3 days a week. You could help her out while you are staying with us." It was a compromise that saved her pride, and Zelda seized on it gratefully. "That would be acceptable. Thank you." Dalton just nodded, his attention back on the horses and the road ahead. The sun was nearly gone now, just a rim of gold along the western hills, and the air was cooling rapidly. Zelda was glad she had worn her traveling coat, even though it had seemed too warm back at the depot. The landscape rolled past in shades of gray and purple, and the only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the steady clop of hooves, and the occasional cry of a bird settling in for the night. "There," Dalton said, pointing ahead. "That is the ranch." Zelda looked where he indicated and saw a cluster of buildings tucked into a fold of the hills. The main house was a low structure made of adobe and wood, with a covered porch that wrapped around the front and one side. There was a barn off to the left, and several smaller outbuildings that might have been a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, and storage sheds. Lamplight glowed in one of the windows of the main house, warm and welcoming in the gathering dark. "My foreman, Tomás, lives in the bunkhouse with his wife Maria," Dalton said as the wagon rolled into the yard. "They have been with me since I bought this place 3 years ago. Good people, hard workers." He pulled the horses to a stop in front of the main house and set the brake. Before Zelda could gather her skirts to climb down, the The front door opened and a man stepped out onto the porch. He was older than Dalton, perhaps in his 40s, with gray-streaked black hair and a weathered face that broke into a smile when he saw the wagon. "Boss, I was starting to worry you got lost," the man said, and his accent was warm and musical, the English slightly accented. Then he saw Zelda and his eyes widened. "Who is this?" "Tomás, this is Miss Zelda Martinson," Dalton said, climbing down from the wagon. "She was stranded at the depot when the railroad shut down. She is going to be staying in the guest room for a few days while she sorts out her situation." Tomás came down the porch steps, his expression shifting from surprise to understanding. "The railroad finally closed then." "We heard it was coming." He turned to Zelda and gave a small, courteous bow. "Welcome to the Merrick Ranch, Miss Martinson. Any friend of the boss is welcome here." "Thank you," Zelda said, accepting Dalton's hand as he helped her down from the wagon. Her legs were stiff from the ride, and she stumbled slightly. Dalton's hand tightened on her arm, steadying her, and for a moment they stood very close together in the dim light. She could smell dust and leather and something else, something clean like soap and fresh air. "Careful," he said quietly, and then stepped back, letting her go. Tomás was already pulling her trunks from the back of the wagon. "I will take these inside. Maria is at our place, but I will send her over first thing in the morning. She will want to meet you." "There is stew on the stove," Dalton said to Zelda. "You must be hungry." She realized. She had not eaten since a hurried breakfast at a station stop that morning, and her stomach was hollow with hunger. "Yes, thank you. That would be very welcome." The inside of the house was simple but clean, with whitewashed walls and heavy wooden furniture that looked handmade. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting area, with a large fireplace at one end and a black iron stove at the other. There was a table with 4 mismatched chairs, a rocking chair near the fireplace, and a few shelves lined with books and odd bits of ranch equipment. 2 doors led off the main room, and Tomás was carrying her trunks through one of them. "That is the guest room," Dalton said, following her gaze. "It has a bed and a washstand and not much else, but the door has a good lock. My room is through there." He pointed to the other door. "Tomás and Maria are in the bunkhouse, about 50 yards that way." He gestured out the window toward the cluster of outbuildings. "It is more than adequate," Zelda said. "Truly, I am grateful for your hospitality." Dalton looked uncomfortable with her thanks, so she let it drop. He busied himself ladling stew from a pot on the stove into 2 bowls while she removed her coat and hat, and tried to smooth her hair, which had come loose from its pins during the wagon ride. The stew smelled like heaven, rich with beef and vegetables, and something spicy that made her mouth water. They sat across from each other at the table, and for a few minutes there was no sound but the clink of spoons against bowls. The stew was delicious, thick and hearty, and Zelda had to force herself to eat slowly instead of gulping it down. When she finally looked up, she found Dalton watching her with something that might have been amusement in his gray eyes. "Maria made it yesterday," he said. "She is the best cook in the county. Everything she makes tastes like this." "Then I am very fortunate," Zelda said. She hesitated, then added, "You mentioned your sister earlier. Does she live nearby?" "No, she is in Colorado with her husband. They have a farm outside Denver." Dalton broke off a piece of bread from the loaf on the table and used it to soak up the last of his stew. "My brother is in Texas, working on a cattle drive. I am the only one who ended up in California. You see them often, not as often as I would like, letters mostly." He stood and carried his empty bowl to the wash basin, then came back for hers. "You should get some rest. It has been a long day for you." It had been, and Zelda felt the exhaustion settling into her bones. She stood, swaying slightly, and Dalton was there again, his hand under her elbow. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I do not know what I would have done if you had not stopped." "You would have figured something out," Dalton said. "You seem like the type who does." It was perhaps the nicest compliment anyone had ever paid her, and Zelda felt warmth spread through her chest. "Good night, Mr. Merrick." "Dalton," he said. "If you are going to be staying here, no point in being formal. Then you should call me Zelda." He nodded, and something passed between them in the lamplight, some wordless acknowledgement that they were two people who had stumbled into each other's lives by accident, but might, possibly, become friends. Then Zelda gathered her carpet bag and retreated to the guest room, closing the door firmly behind her and turning the key in the lock just to hear it click. The room was small but clean, just as Dalton had promised. There was a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a small dresser with 3 drawers. Her trunk sat at the foot of the bed, and through the single window she could see the dark shapes of the hills against a sky full of stars. She had never seen so many stars, not in Philadelphia where the lights and smoke obscured them. Here, they blazed overhead like 1,000 tiny fires, and Zelda stood at the window for a long time, trying to understand how her life had turned upside down in the space of a single day. Finally, she turned away and began unpacking the essentials: her nightgown, her brush, her few toiletries. She washed her face and hands in the cold water from the pitcher, changed into her nightgown, and climbed between the sheets. The mattress was stuffed with straw and smelled faintly of lavender, and despite everything, despite the strangeness and the fear and the uncertainty, Zelda felt safe. The door was locked. She had food in her belly. And somewhere on the other side of the wall, Dalton Merrick was probably settling down for the night, a man who had stopped to help a stranger for no reason other than kindness. She fell asleep thinking about his gray eyes and his quiet voice and the strength in his hands when he had steadied her, and her dreams were full of horses and hills and a sky that went on forever. Morning came with the sound of voices outside her window. Zelda woke disoriented, tangled in unfamiliar sheets, and for a moment could not remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The closed depot, Dalton's offer, the ride to the ranch. She sat up and saw that the sun was already well above the horizon, slanting golden light through the window. She had slept later than she had intended, exhausted from travel and stress. She dressed quickly in a simple calico dress, brushed and repinned her hair, and opened the door to find the main room empty. The voices were coming from outside, and when she stepped onto the porch, she saw Dalton and Tamaz near the barn, deep in conversation. A woman was with them, small and dark-haired, with a brightly colored shawl wrapped around her shoulders despite the growing warmth of the day. The woman looked up and saw Zelda, and her face broke into a smile. She said something to the men, then hurried across the yard toward the house. "Miss Martinson, buenos dias. I am Maria, Tamaz's wife. Welcome, welcome." She was younger than Zelda had expected, probably in her late 30s, with laugh lines around her eyes and a warmth that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a stove. She climbed the porch steps and took Zelda's hands in hers, squeezing them gently. "Tamaz told me what happened, that the railroad closed and left you stranded. Such a terrible thing. But do not worry, you are safe here. The boss, he is a good man, very honorable. And you will help me with the work, yes. It will be nice to have another woman around. All these men, sometimes I think they forget how to talk about anything but cows and horses." Zelda found herself smiling despite everything. "I would be happy to help in any way I can." "Good, good. Come, I will show you what needs doing, and we will talk and get to know each other." The boss, He already ate and went out to check the herd. He said to tell you there is coffee on the stove and bread in the box if you are hungry. The coffee was strong and hot, and the bread was yesterday's but still good with a smear of butter from the crock Maria produced from the cold cellar. They ate standing up in the kitchen while Maria chattered about the ranch, about Tomás, about how they had come to California from Mexico 10 years ago looking for work and had been with Dalton since he bought the place. "He is lonely, I think," Maria said, lowering her voice even though there was no one else to hear. "He works so hard, and he never goes into town except for supplies. No wife, no sweetheart. It is not good for a man to be so alone." "Perhaps he prefers his own company," Zelda said, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Perhaps," Maria said, but her eyes were knowing. "Or perhaps he has not met the right woman yet." Before Zelda could respond, Maria was bustling around the kitchen, pulling out pots and rags and a basket full of vegetables that needed peeling. "Come, we have work to do. These men, they cannot survive without us to feed them and keep the house from falling down around their ears." They fell into an easy rhythm, Maria directing and Zelda following, and by midday the kitchen was spotless. The laundry was hanging on a line behind the house, and a pot of beans was simmering on the stove for dinner. Maria was as efficient as she was talkative, and Zelda found herself relaxing in her presence, grateful for the company and the distraction from her own uncertain future. Dalton came back at noon, dusty and tired, with Tomás trailing behind him. They washed up at the pump in the yard, then came inside for the cold lunch Maria had prepared, bread and cheese and sliced ham with pickles from a jar in the cellar. Dalton nodded to Zelda when he sat down, his expression unreadable, and she nodded back, suddenly shy. "The herd looks good," he said to Tomás. "We should be able to make the drive to San Luis Obispo next month if the weather holds." "And if we can find enough hands," Tomás said. "Half the cowboys in the county have moved on, looking for work elsewhere. We will figure it out." Dalton glanced at Zelda, then back at Tomás. "Did you hear anything about the schoolhouse when you were in town last week? If they still have students," Tomás shrugged. "I heard Mrs. Donovan saying she was trying to find someone to teach her children and the Sullivan kids, maybe a few others. But I do not think there is any money for a real teacher." "What if someone was willing to teach for room and board?" Dalton asked, still not looking directly at Zelda. She felt her heart jump in her chest. "Are you suggesting I could teach here, at the ranch?" "Not at the ranch," Dalton said. "But if the town cannot afford a teacher, maybe some of the families would be willing to send their children here a few days a week and pay in goods instead of cash. You would have a place to stay and food, and you would be teaching, which is what you trained for." "That is a brilliant idea," Maria exclaimed. "Zelda, you could stay here in the guest room and teach the children in town during the day, or the families could bring them here like Dalton said. Either way, you would have work and a home." "But the guest room is not mine to occupy indefinitely," Zelda protested, even as hope bloomed in her chest. "This is your home, Dalton. I cannot impose on you for weeks or months." "It is not an imposition if you are working for it," Dalton said. "You help Maria with the house, teach the local children, and you have a place to stay until you figure out what you want to do next. Or until the railroad comes back, though I would not hold my breath on that. Why are you doing this?" Zelda asked, the question bursting out of her before she could stop it. "You do not know me. You owe me nothing. Why would you go out of your way to help me?" Dalton finally looked at her directly, and his gray eyes were serious. "Because you need help and I can give it. That is reason enough." It was, Zelda realized, the simple truth. He was not looking for anything in return, not trying to take advantage, just offering a solution to a problem because he could. It was so different from everything she had known in Philadelphia, where every favor came with strings attached and every kindness had a price, that she felt tears prick at the back of her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I accept. And I will do everything I can to earn my keep and not be a burden to you." "You are not a burden," Dalton said, and there was something in his voice, some warmth she had not heard before, that made her look up sharply. But he had already turned back to his lunch, and the moment passed. That afternoon, Zelda and Maria walked into town to speak with the families about the possibility of teaching. It was a long walk in the heat, and by the time they reached the main street, Zelda's dress was sticking to her back and her feet ached. But Maria was unstoppable, marching up to doors and knocking briskly, explaining the situation in her rapid-fire English mixed with Spanish when she got excited. Mrs. Donovan, a harried woman with 4 children under the age of 10, nearly wept with relief when Maria explained that Zelda was a trained teacher willing to teach for room and board plus whatever the families could spare in the way of goods. "My children are falling behind," she said, gripping Zelda's hands. "I try to teach them myself, but I have no education past the 6th grade, and I do not know how to do the mathematics or the history. If you could teach them, even just the basics, I would be so grateful. I can pay in eggs and milk from our cow, and my husband can bring firewood to the ranch for Mr. Merrick." The Sullivan family had 2 boys who were bright-eyed and curious, and their mother agreed immediately to send them 3 days a week in exchange for fresh vegetables from her garden. Another family, the Hendersons, had 3 girls ranging in age from 7 to 13, and their father was the town blacksmith. He offered to shoe Dalton's horses and repair any tools that needed fixing in exchange for Zelda teaching his daughters. By the time they walked back to the ranch in the cooling evening air, Zelda had 9 students committed, ranging in age from 6 to 13, and a promise from several families to spread the word to the outlying farms. She would teach at the schoolhouse in town 3 days a week, and the families would take turns providing transportation, either bringing the children themselves or arranging for Dalton or one of the other ranchers to pick them up. "You see," Maria said triumphantly as the ranch buildings came into view, "everything works out. You have a position, the children have a teacher, and you have a home with us for as long as you need it." "I am teaching for goods, not money," Zelda pointed out. "I will still need cash eventually if I want to go anywhere or buy anything. So you will save the little bit you have, and the families will pay in goods, and the boss will give you room and board. In a year or 2, you will have enough saved to go wherever you want. Or maybe," Maria added with a sly smile, "by then you will not want to leave." Zelda did not answer because she did not know what to say. The idea of staying here in this harsh and beautiful land felt both impossible and strangely appealing. She had been in Paso Robles less than 24 hours, but already the rhythm of the ranch was seeping into her bones. The quiet and the space, and the sense of purpose that came from working with your hands and seeing the results. Dalton was in the barn when they got back, and Zelda went to find him, suddenly eager to share the news. He was grooming one of the horses, his movements careful and methodical, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "How did it go?" "Very well," Zelda said, and could not keep the excitement out of her voice. "I have 9 students with the possibility of more, and the families have agreed to pay in goods and services. I will start teaching on Monday, 3 days a week at the schoolhouse. That is good news." Dalton set down the brush he had been using and came toward her, and Zelda saw something in his face, some genuine pleasure that made her chest feel warm. "I am glad it worked out." "It is because of you," Zelda said. If you had not stopped at the depot, if you had not offered me a place to stay, I do not know what I would have done." "You would have found a way," Dalton said again, the same thing he had said the night before. "You are stronger than you think." "How do you know?" Zelda asked, genuinely curious. "You have only just met me." "Because you got on a train and crossed half the country by yourself to take a position in a town you had never seen," Dalton said. "Because when you found out your aunt was dead and the railroad was closed, you did not fall apart. You sat down on your trunk and tried to figure out what to do next. That takes strength." No one had ever said anything like that to her before, and Zelda felt heat flood her cheeks. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." They stood there in the barn, the late afternoon light slanting through the gaps in the walls, and Zelda was suddenly very aware of how close they were standing, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, and the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders. He smelled like horses and leather and sweat, and it should have been unpleasant but somehow was not. "I should help Maria with dinner," she said, breaking the spell. "And I should finish with the horses," Dalton said, but neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Zelda turned and walked back toward the house, feeling his gaze on her back the whole way. The days fell into a pattern after that. Zelda taught at the schoolhouse 3 days a week, riding into town with Dalton in the wagon when he had business there, or catching a ride with one of the fathers who was bringing his children. The schoolhouse was a small building with peeling paint and a leaky roof, but the children were eager to learn and well-behaved, and Zelda found herself loving the work in a way she never had at the Girls' Academy in Philadelphia. Here, the students were not wealthy young ladies who saw education as a social requirement, but children who understood that learning was a gift and a tool, something that could change their lives. On the days she did not teach, she helped Maria with the endless work of running a ranch household, cooking, cleaning, mending, preserving vegetables and fruit from the small garden behind the house. Maria taught her how to make tortillas, and how to render lard and how to get blood stains out of work shirts. In return, Zelda taught Maria how to read English beyond the simple words she already knew, and they spent their evenings sitting at the kitchen table with books from Dalton's small collection, sounding out words together and laughing at their mistakes. Dalton was gone most days from dawn until dusk, working the cattle with Tamaz and the 2 seasonal hands he had hired for the fall roundup. He came home exhausted and dusty, ate whatever Maria and Zelda had prepared, and usually fell asleep in the rocking chair near the fire before rousing himself to stumble off to bed. But on Sundays, when even ranchers took a half-day of rest, he was more present, and Zelda found herself looking forward to those afternoons more than she wanted to admit. They fell into the habit of walking after Sunday dinner, just the 2 of them, up into the hills where the cattle grazed and the live oaks grew in twisted groves. Dalton showed her the ranch boundaries, and the places where water pooled in the rainy season, and the hidden meadows where wildflowers bloomed in the spring. He told her about buying the ranch with money he had saved from working cattle drives, about the hard first year when he had almost lost everything to drought, about his hopes of expanding the herd and maybe one day buying the neighboring property if it ever came up for sale. Zelda told him about Philadelphia, about growing up in a narrow house on a narrow street where everyone knew everyone else's business, about her mother dying when she was 12 and her father remarrying within 6 months to a woman who resented having stepchildren. She told him about the Girls' Academy, about how she had loved teaching but hated the politics, and the way the wealthy parents treated the staff like servants. She told him about the letter from Aunt Margaret, about how it had seemed like a lifeline, a chance to start over somewhere new. "And now here you are," Dalton said one Sunday in late October as they sat on a sun-warmed rock overlooking the valley. "Starting over in a place you never intended to be." "Yes," Zelda said, "but I find I do not mind as much as I thought I would. It is beautiful here. Harsh but beautiful." "It is not for everyone," Dalton said. "It takes a certain kind of person to love this land." What kind of person? He thought about it, his gray eyes distant. Someone who does not need things to be easy. Someone who can see past the hard work and the dust and the loneliness to what is underneath. And what is underneath? Freedom, Dalton said simply. The freedom to build something with your own hands, to make your own choices, to live on your own terms. That is worth more than comfort, at least to me. Zelda thought about that as they walked back to the ranch in the slanting afternoon light. She had never thought of herself as someone who valued freedom above comfort, but she was beginning to understand what Dalton meant. Here, she was not bound by the expectations of Philadelphia society or the disapproval of her stepmother or the judgment of the academy's headmistress. She was just Zelda, a teacher and a worker and a woman finding her own way. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. By the time November arrived, Zelda had been at the ranch for 6 weeks, and she could no longer imagine leaving. She had grown used to the routine of the days, the sound of Dalton's boots on the porch in the morning, the smell of coffee and Maria's cooking, the weight of the work and the satisfaction of falling into bed exhausted every night. Her students were thriving under her instruction, and several more families from outlying farms had asked if she could take on their children as well. She now had 14 students, and the schoolhouse was crowded but full of energy and laughter. She had also grown used to Dalton in a way that should have worried her, but did not. She noticed things about him now that she had not at first. The way he always gave his horse an extra handful of oats at the end of a long day, the way he listened carefully when someone was speaking and never interrupted, the way his face softened when he looked at the hills in the morning light. She noticed the way his hands moved when he was working, competent and sure, and the way his voice got quieter when he was tired or upset. She noticed that he never raised his voice, even when things went wrong, and that he treated everyone with the same steady respect, whether it was Tamaz or one of the seasonal hands or the shopkeeper in town. She noticed, too, the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention, his gray eyes thoughtful and intent. Those looks made her heart beat faster, made heat pool in her belly, made her wonder what he was thinking and if he felt even a fraction of what she was beginning to feel for him. It all came to a head one Friday evening in mid-November. Zelda had stayed late at the schoolhouse, helping one of the Henderson girls with her arithmetic, and by the time she finished and walked out into the gathering dusk, the last wagon had already left. She stood on the steps of the schoolhouse, trying to decide if she should walk the 5 miles back to the ranch in the dark or see if the Donovans would let her sleep on their floor for the night, when she heard the familiar sound of wagon wheels. Dalton pulled up in front of the schoolhouse, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "Maria said you would need a ride," he said. "She sent me to fetch you." Relief flooded through Zelda, though she tried to hide it. "I am sorry to trouble you. I should have kept better track of the time." "It is no trouble." Dalton climbed down and helped her up onto the wagon seat, and his hand was warm and firm around hers. They headed out of town in the direction of the ranch, and for a while neither of them spoke. The night was cool and clear, with a wind blowing in from the ocean that smelled of salt and distance. "Dalton," Zelda said finally, because she could not keep the question inside any longer. "Why are you so kind to me?" He glanced at her, then back at the road. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you have gone out of your way to help me at every turn. You took me in when I had nowhere to go. You help me find a teaching position. You give me a place to stay and never ask for anything in return beyond a few chores that hardly repay what you have given me. Why?" Dalton was silent for so long that Zelda thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, "At first it was because you reminded me of my sister, alone in a strange place trying to be brave. But now—" "Now," Zelda prompted, her heart pounding. "Now it is because I like having you here," Dalton said, and his voice was rough. "I like hearing your voice in the house and watching you with the children and seeing the way you laugh with Maria. I like the way you work hard and never complain, and the way you look at the hills like they are something precious. I like you, Zelda, more than I should after only 6 weeks, and I do not know what to do about it." Zelda felt like all the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She stared at him in the darkness, at the strong line of his jaw and the way his hands gripped the reins, and realized that she had been waiting for him to say something like this, hoping for it without admitting it to herself. "I like you too," she said, and her voice came out breathless. "I have been trying not to because I did not want to presume and because I owe you so much already. But I do, like you, I mean, very much." Dalton pulled the wagon to a stop and set the brake. They were halfway between town and the ranch, on a stretch of road where the hills rolled away on either side and the stars blazed overhead. He turned to face her, and in the dim light from the rising moon, she could see the intensity in his eyes. "I do not want you to feel obligated," he said. "You do not owe me anything, Zelda. If you want to leave to find a position somewhere else or go back east, I will help you do that. But if you want to stay, if you think there could be something between us, then I would like to see where it goes. I am not good with words, and I cannot offer you much beyond a hard life on a small ranch, but I can promise you that I would do everything in my power to make you happy." It was the longest speech Zelda had ever heard him make, and every word of it went straight to her heart. She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his, and felt him squeeze gently in response. "I do not need fine words or an easy life," she said. "I need honesty and kindness and someone who sees me for who I am, and that is you, Dalton. You have been that from the moment you stopped at the depot and offered me help. So yes, I want to stay. And yes, I want to see where this goes." Dalton let out a breath she had not realized he was holding, and then he was cupping her face in his free hand, his palm rough and warm against her skin. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, and Zelda's heart nearly burst at the question, at the fact that he was asking instead of assuming. "Yes," she whispered, and then his mouth was on hers, gentle and searching, and she felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. His lips were chapped from the sun and wind, but they moved against hers with a tenderness that made her ache. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, and for a long moment there was nothing but the two of them and the stars and the wild, open land all around. When they finally pulled apart, Zelda was breathless and trembling, and Dalton looked like he had been struck by lightning. "We should get back," he said hoarsely, "before Maria sends out a search party." Zelda laughed, the sound shaky but genuine, and Dalton smiled at her, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face and made him look years younger. They rode the rest of the way to the ranch in a charged silence, hands linked on the wagon seat, and when they arrived, Maria took one look at them and started grinning so wide, Zelda thought her face might split. "Finally," Maria said under her breath as she bustled past Zelda into the house. "I was beginning to think you two would never figure it out." That night, after dinner and after Maria and Tamaz had gone back to the bunkhouse, Dalton walked Zelda to the door of the guest room. They stood in the dim hallway, close enough to touch but not quite touching, and Zelda felt the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on her chest. "Good night," Dalton said softly. Sleep well." "Good night," Zelda echoed, and then, on impulse, she stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. His skin was warm and slightly rough with stubble, and she heard his breath catch. Then she slipped into her room and closed the door, leaning against it with her hand pressed to her racing heart. She did not sleep well that night. Her mind was too full of Dalton's words, and his kiss, and the feel of his hand in hers. But when morning came and she walked out into the kitchen to find him already up and making coffee, the smile he gave her made every sleepless hour worthwhile. Over the next weeks, they courted in the small spaces between work and responsibility. Dalton would find excuses to drive her to town, even when one of the fathers was already coming to pick her up. They would sit on the porch after dinner and talk while Maria and Tomás pretended not to notice. On Sundays, their walks grew longer, and they would find secluded spots where they could sit close together and steal kisses that grew more heated with each passing week. Dalton was a considerate and careful lover, even in those early, chaste moments. He never pushed for more than Zelda was ready to give, never made her feel like she owed him anything. But Zelda could feel the restraint in him, the way his hands would tighten on her waist before he forced himself to let go, the way his kisses would deepen and then deliberately gentle. She appreciated his respect for her virtue, but she also found herself wanting more, wanting to know what it would feel like to be truly his in every way. December arrived with cooler weather and rain that turned the hills green almost overnight. The cattle drive to San Luis Obispo was delayed by the weather, then delayed again when one of the seasonal hands broke his leg falling from a horse. Money was tight, and Zelda could see the worry lines deepening around Dalton's eyes even as he tried to hide it. "Let me help," she said one evening when Maria had gone home and they were alone in the kitchen. "I have a little money saved. It is not much, but it could buy feed or pay one of the hands." "No," Dalton said immediately. "Absolutely not. I will not take your money, Zelda." "Why not? We are." She hesitated, not quite sure what word to use. Courting seemed too old-fashioned, but they were not engaged, not officially. "We are together," Dalton finished for her. "But that does not mean I am going to take advantage of you financially. You need that money in case." He stopped, jaw tightening. "In case what? In case you decide you do not want me after all." Zelda felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp. "Is that what you think? That I am only here until something better comes along?" "No." Dalton scrubbed a hand over his face. "No, that is not what I think. But I have to be realistic, Zelda. I am a struggling rancher with more debts than assets. You are an educated woman who could find a position at a real school in a real town and make a real life for herself. I cannot ask you to tie yourself to me and my failing ranch." "You are not asking," Zelda said, stepping closer to him. "I am offering. There is a difference." They stared at each other across the kitchen, and Zelda saw the moment when Dalton's resolve began to crumble. His shoulders sagged, and he reached for her, pulling her into his arms and burying his face in her hair. "I am terrified of losing this place," he admitted, his voice muffled. "I have put everything I have into it, and if the drive does not go well, if the prices are too low or we lose too many head on the way, I could lose it all. And if I lose the ranch, I have nothing to offer you." "You have yourself," Zelda said fiercely, pulling back to look him in the eye. "That is enough, Dalton. That has always been enough." He kissed her then, hard and desperate, and Zelda kissed him back with everything she had. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers and said, "Marry me." Zelda's heart stopped. "What?" "Marry me," Dalton said again. "I know it is too soon, and I know I should do this properly with a ring and a speech, but I do not want to wait. I want you to be my wife, Zelda. I want to build a life with you, whether it is here on this ranch or somewhere else." I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want everything, and I want it with you." Tears were streaming down Zelda's face, but she was smiling so hard her cheeks ached. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you. I want all of that too." Dalton let out a shaky laugh and kissed her again, softer this time, his hands cradling her face like she was something precious and fragile. "I will get you a ring," he promised, "as soon as I can afford one, and we will do it properly with a preacher and whatever kind of wedding you want." "I do not need a ring or a fancy wedding," Zelda said. "I just need you." But Dalton was already shaking his head. "You deserve better than a rushed proposal in a kitchen. Let me do this right, Zelda. Let me give you something to remember." She agreed because she could see how important it was to him, and because she loved him for wanting to do right by her. They told Maria and Tomás the next day, and Maria cried and hugged them both and immediately started planning the wedding even though they had not set a date. Tomás shook Dalton's hand solemnly and told Zelda that she was getting a good man, the best man he had ever worked for, and Zelda believed him. The cattle drive finally happened in early January, delayed but not defeated. Dalton and Tomás and 3 hired hands drove 200 head of cattle down to San Luis Obispo, a journey that took 5 days through the coastal hills and valleys. Zelda stayed at the ranch with Maria, teaching her students and trying not to worry about Dalton out on the trail. But she did worry, could not help it, because driving cattle was dangerous work and anything could happen. He came back 10 days after he left, exhausted and filthy and grinning wider than Zelda had ever seen. The drive had gone well, the cattle had sold for a good price, and he had enough money to pay off his debts, pay his hands, and still have a little left over. He swept Zelda off her feet in the middle of the yard, spinning her around while she laughed and Maria whooped and clapped. "We are going to make it," he said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "The ranch is going to make it." "I never doubted it," Zelda lied, and Dalton kissed her for it. That evening he presented her with a ring. It was simple, just a thin gold band with a small garnet stone, but Zelda loved it more than she would have loved the most expensive diamond. "It was my grandmother's," Dalton said as he slid it onto her finger. "My mother gave it to me before she died and told me to save it for the woman I wanted to spend my life with. I cannot think of anyone I would rather give it to than you." The ring fit perfectly, and Zelda stared at it on her hand, at the way the garnet caught the firelight and glowed like a tiny ember. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." They were married 3 weeks later on a clear February morning in the small church at the edge of town. The preacher was an old man with kind eyes who had known Dalton since he first arrived in Paso Robles, and he smiled at them both as he led them through the vows. Zelda wore her best dress, a blue cotton with lace at the collar that Maria had helped her press and starch until it looked almost new. Dalton wore a new shirt, white and crisp, and had trimmed his hair and shaved so carefully that Zelda could see a tiny nick on his jaw where the razor had slipped. Maria and Tomás stood as witnesses, and a handful of townspeople came to watch, the families of her students and a few of the shopkeepers who had come to know Zelda over the past months. It was a small wedding, simple and quick, but when Dalton said, "I do," and slid a second ring onto her finger, a matching gold band to sit beside the garnet, Zelda felt like her heart would burst from happiness. The kiss after the preacher pronounced them husband and wife was chaste because they were in a church, but Zelda could feel the promise in it, the heat that Dalton was carefully banking until they were alone. They walked back down the aisle hand in hand, and the townspeople threw rice and called out congratulations, and Zelda felt like she was floating. Maria had prepared a feast back at the ranch, and they spent the afternoon eating and laughing and accepting well wishes from the neighbors who stopped by. Tamaz got a little drunk on the whiskey someone had brought and told embarrassing stories about Dalton's early days as a rancher, and Dalton bore it with good humor, his arm around Zelda's waist the whole time. As the sun began to set and the guests began to drift away, Maria hugged Zelda tightly and whispered, "Be happy, my amiga. You deserve it." "I am happy," Zelda whispered back. "Happier than I ever thought possible." Finally, they were alone. Tamaz and Maria had tactfully retreated to the bunkhouse, and the main house was quiet except for the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Dalton and Zelda stood in the middle of the main room, suddenly shy with each other now that they were husband and wife. "I should," Zelda began, then stopped, not sure what she should do. Change into her nightgown, wait for Dalton to say something. She had almost no experience with men beyond the chaste kisses they had shared, and she felt woefully unprepared for what was supposed to happen next. "We do not have to do anything tonight," Dalton said gently, as if reading her mind. "I know this is all new for you, and I do not want you to feel rushed or pressured. We have the rest of our lives, Zelda. There is no hurry." His kindness made her love him even more, but it also made her brave. "I want to," she said, lifting her chin. "I want to be your wife in every way. I am just nervous, that is all." "So am I," Dalton admitted, and Zelda looked at him in surprise. "You are?" "I have never been with someone I loved before," he said quietly. "I have never had this much to lose." "So yes, I am nervous." The honesty of it steadied her. She crossed the room to him and took his hand. "Then we will figure it out together." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and led her to his room, which was now their room. The bed was made with fresh sheets, courtesy of Maria, and someone had left a lamp burning low on the dresser. Dalton closed the door behind them, and the sound of the latch clicking shut sent a shiver of anticipation down Zelda's spine. What followed was tender and awkward and ultimately wonderful. Dalton was patient and careful, talking her through every step, making sure she was comfortable and ready before he moved forward. There was pain, but also pleasure, and the intimacy of it, the feeling of being completely vulnerable and completely safe at the same time, brought tears to Zelda's eyes. When it was over and they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, both breathing hard, Dalton kissed her forehead and whispered, "I love you." "I love you too," Zelda whispered back, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They lay awake for a long time, talking softly in the darkness, learning the shape of each other's bodies and the rhythm of each other's breathing. Dalton told her about his dreams for the ranch, about wanting to expand the herd and maybe build a new barn come spring. Zelda told him about her hopes for the school, about maybe finding a way to get more books and supplies for her students. They talked about the future, about whether they wanted children and where they might travel if they could afford it someday. "I want at least 3, Dalton said when she asked about children. "A big family like the one I grew up in. What about you?" "I would like that," Zelda said, smiling in the darkness. "A house full of children and noise and laughter. It sounds perfect." "It will not be easy," Dalton warned. "Ranch life is hard and raising children here is harder, but we will do it together." "Together," Zelda agreed and kissed him to seal the promise. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and when Zelda woke in the morning to find Dalton still beside her, his arm heavy and warm across her waist, she felt a contentment she had never known before. This was her life now. This man, this ranch, this wild and beautiful land. It was not what she had planned when she left Philadelphia, but it was exactly what she needed. The months that followed were some of the happiest of Zelda's life. She settled into her role as Dalton's wife and the lady of the ranch. Such as it was, dividing her time between teaching and helping with the endless work that came with running a household. She learned to shoot a rifle when Dalton insisted she needed to know how to protect herself, and discovered she had a natural talent for it. She learned to ride horseback, tentatively at first and then with growing confidence, and Dalton gave her a gentle mare named Rosie, who became her constant companion on trips to town. Her school continued to grow, and by the spring of 1884 she had 20 students ranging in age from 5 to 15. The families paid in goods as they had promised, and the ranch benefited from the extra vegetables, eggs, milk, and skilled labor. Dalton and the blacksmith, Mr. Henderson, became friends, and Henderson taught Dalton some basic blacksmithing skills that saved them money on repairs. In May, Zelda realized she had missed her monthly courses twice and felt a flutter of excitement and fear. She waited another week to be sure, then told Dalton one evening after dinner. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, worry, more joy, and finally settled on a grin so wide it made Zelda laugh. "We are going to have a baby," he said, as if he could not quite believe it. "You are going to be a mother." "And you are going to be a father," Zelda said, taking his hands. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Dalton said, and pulled her into his arms. That night, they lay in bed and talked about names and whether it would be a boy or a girl, and what kind of parents they wanted to be. Dalton was nervous about being a good father, worried that his own rough upbringing had not prepared him. But Zelda reassured him that he would be wonderful, that he was already kind and patient, and exactly the kind of man any child would be lucky to have as a father. The pregnancy was relatively easy, though Zelda was exhausted and nauseated for the first few months. Maria fussed over her constantly, making her special teas and forcing her to rest even when there was work to be done. Dalton became ridiculously overprotective, insisting she not lift anything heavy or ride Rosie or walk too far in the heat. Zelda found it equal parts endearing and exasperating, but she loved him for it. She taught through the summer, though she had to sit down more often and take breaks when the heat became too much. By September, when school started again after the summer break, she was visibly pregnant and her students were fascinated and full of questions. She answered them as honestly as she could while still being appropriate, and enjoyed seeing their excitement about the new baby. In early December, as the hills turned green again with winter rain, Zelda went into labor. It was a long and difficult birth, lasting nearly 20 hours, and there were moments when Dalton looked so terrified that Zelda worried more about him than herself. But Maria was there, and the doctor from town, and finally, in the early morning hours of December 7th, Zelda gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Daniel Thomas Merrick, after Dalton's father and Zelda's brother, and he was perfect. 10 tiny fingers and 10 tiny toes, and a shock of dark hair that looked just like his father's. Dalton held him for the first time with shaking hands, staring down at his son like he had been handed a miracle, and Zelda fell in love with both of them all over again. "He is so small," Dalton whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "How can something so small be so perfect?" "He is ours," Zelda said, exhausted but happy. "Our son." The first months with Daniel were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings, and learning how to care for a tiny human who seemed determined to cry at the most inconvenient times. But they managed, with Maria's help and advice, and slowly found their rhythm as parents. Zelda took a break from teaching for the spring semester, and the families understood, promising to wait for her to return when she was ready. Daniel was 6 months old when Zelda realized she was pregnant again. She laughed when the doctor confirmed it, both delighted and slightly panicked at the thought of two babies so close together. But Dalton took the news in stride, and by the time their daughter was born in March of 1886, they were as ready as they could be. They named her Margaret Rose, after Zelda's aunt, and the wild roses that bloomed in the hills every spring. She was tinier than Daniel had been, with reddish gold hair and green eyes that everyone said she must have gotten from Zelda's side of the family. Daniel, barely 16 months old, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to touch her constantly, and Dalton spent half his time keeping his son from accidentally smothering his daughter with affection. The ranch continued to grow along with their family. The cattle business improved as the country recovered from the economic troubles of the early 80s, and Dalton was able to hire 2 more permanent hands and expand the herd to over 400 head. They built a new barn and repaired the roof on the main house and added a second bedroom for the children. Money was still tight, but they were no longer living on the edge of disaster, and that was its own kind of wealth. Zelda went back to teaching when Margaret was a year old, bringing both children with her to the schoolhouse 3 days a week. They slept in a makeshift nursery she set up in the corner of the classroom, and her older students took turns watching them during lessons. It was chaotic and exhausting, but it worked, and Zelda loved every minute of it. By 1888, Paso Robles was starting to come back to life. Rumors of a new railroad line coming through the area brought fresh hope and new businesses. The hotel was bought and renovated by a family from San Francisco, and the main street gained a new restaurant and a proper general store. The town was still small, but it was no longer dying, and the families who had stayed were rewarded with the knowledge that they had weathered the worst and come out the other side. Zelda was 30 years old and pregnant with their third child when Dalton surprised her one spring evening by taking her up into the hills to the spot where they had sat and talked on so many Sunday afternoons. The children were with Maria for the evening, and it was just the two of them and the sunset and the endless sky. "I want to show you something," Dalton said, and led her to a small grove of oak trees she had never noticed before. In the center of the grove was a flat area with a view that took her breath away. You could see for miles in every direction, down to the valley where the ranch lay tucked into the hills, out to the distant mountains, and even a sliver of the ocean on clear days. "I bought the land," Dalton said, watching her face. 20 acres, including this grove. I thought maybe someday, when we have saved enough, we could build a bigger house here. One with enough room for all our children and grandchildren, with a porch where we can sit and watch the sun go down." Zelda turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "It is perfect," she whispered. "Absolutely perfect." "We have come a long way from that day at the depot," Dalton said, pulling her close. "I never imagined, when I stopped to help a stranded woman with her trunks, that I would be standing here 5 years later with a wife and 2 children and another on the way. You changed my life, Zelda." "You changed mine," Zelda said, looking up at him. "You offered me a wagon and a wedding ring, and a future I never dreamed possible. I was waiting for a train that was never coming, and you gave me something so much better." They stood there in the grove, holding each other as the sun sank below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of gold and rose and purple. The land stretched out around them, wild and beautiful and theirs, and Zelda felt a peace settle over her that went bone deep. Their third child was another boy, born in September of 1888. They named him James William, and he was louder and more energetic than his older siblings combined. Daniel, now nearly 4, took his role as big brother seriously, and Margaret, 2.5, mothered the baby with the fierce devotion only a toddler could muster. The house was constantly full of noise and laughter, and the organized chaos that came with 3 small children, and Zelda loved every exhausting minute of it. She had cut back her teaching to 2 days a week, and one of her former students, a young woman named Sarah Henderson, had taken over the other 3 days. Sarah was smart and capable and loved teaching almost as much as Zelda did, and together they had built the school into something the town was proud of. More families were moving to Paso Robles, drawn by the promise of the new railroad and the growing economy, and the school enrollment had nearly doubled in the past year. The new railroad came through in the summer of 1889, and with it came even more changes. Paso Robles was officially connected to the wider world again, and the town celebrated with a week-long festival that drew people from all over the county. Dalton and Zelda brought the children into town for the festivities, and Daniel was entranced by the sight of the train, so different from the stories his mother had told him about being stranded at the depot. "That is where you met Papa?" Daniel asked, pointing at the newly rebuilt station. "That is where I met Papa," Zelda confirmed, holding Margaret's hand while James slept against Dalton's shoulder. "The old depot closed, and Papa offered me his wagon and brought me home to the ranch. And then you got married," Margaret said, because she loved hearing the story. "And then we got married," Zelda agreed. "And then we had you. And me," Daniel added quickly. "And you and James," Zelda said, laughing. "And now here we all are." "Here we all are," Dalton echoed, his free arm coming around Zelda's waist. They stood together on the platform of the new depot, watching the train pull in with a hiss of steam and a screech of brakes. And Zelda thought about how different her life was from what she had imagined that day in 1883. She had thought she was coming to Paso Robles to teach at a small town school and live with an aunt she barely knew. Instead, she had found a home, a husband, a family, and a purpose that fulfilled her in ways she had never expected. The years rolled on, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. The ranch continued to prosper, and by 1892, Dalton had saved enough to begin building the new house in the grove of oaks. It took 2 years to complete, built slowly as money and time allowed, but when they finally moved in during the summer of 1894, it was everything they had dreamed of. The house was large and airy, with 4 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and the wide porch Dalton had promised. There was even a small room off the kitchen that Zelda claimed as her study, where she could prepare lessons and grade papers without being interrupted by the children every 5 minutes. They had added a 4th child to the family by then, a daughter named Lucy Ann, born in 1891. She had Dalton's gray eyes and Zelda's determination, and by the age of 3, she was already keeping up with her older siblings and refusing to be left behind. The children thrived on the ranch, growing brown and strong and fearless, learning to ride and rope and do the 100 small tasks that came with ranch life. Daniel, now nearly 10, was already talking about being a rancher like his father. Margaret, 8, had inherited her mother's love of teaching and spent hours organizing her younger siblings into makeshift classrooms, where she would drill them on their letters and numbers. James, 6, was the wild one, always getting into mischief and coming home covered in mud or dust, or occasionally blood from his latest adventure. And Lucy, the baby at 3, was spoiled rotten by all of them and knew it. Zelda had officially retired from teaching the year Lucy was born, handing over the school entirely to Sarah Henderson, who had married one of Dalton's ranch hands and settled permanently in Paso Robles. But Zelda still tutored students privately a few times a week, children who needed extra help or were preparing for higher education, and she loved the work as much as ever. Dalton, now in his late 30s, had grown into his role as both rancher and father. The hard edges of his youth had softened, and the man who had once been guarded and careful with his words now laughed easily and told stories to his children and kissed his wife in full view of the hands without embarrassment. He had become a respected figure in the community, serving on the town council and helping to organize the annual cattle auction that brought buyers from as far away as San Francisco. On their 10th wedding anniversary in February of 1894, Dalton took Zelda back to the spot on the road where he had first kissed her, where he had asked her to marry him all those years ago. The hills were green with winter rain, and wildflowers were just beginning to bloom in sheltered spots. "I have been thinking about that night a lot lately," Dalton said as they stood looking out at the valley. "About how terrified I was and how sure I was that you would say no." "I was never going to say no," Zelda said, leaning into his side. "I think I knew even then that you were it for me, that I would never find anyone else who understood me the way you do." "I asked you to marry me because I was afraid of losing you," Dalton admitted. "The ranch was failing, and I thought if I could not offer you security, at least I could offer you commitment. But you married me anyway, even knowing it might all fall apart." "I married you because I loved you," Zelda said firmly. "The ranch, the money, none of that mattered. It was you I wanted, Dalton. Just you." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and Zelda felt the same spark she had felt that first night, the same sense of rightness and belonging. 10 years of marriage, 4 children, countless hardships and triumphs, and she still felt her heart race when he looked at her like that. "Thank you," Dalton said when they finally pulled apart. "For saying yes that night, for building this life with me, for everything." "Thank you for stopping at the depot," Zelda said. "For offering me a ride and a place to stay and a future I never could have imagined. You saved me, Dalton." "We saved each other," he corrected, and Zelda knew he was right. The years continued to pass, marked by birthdays and holidays and the steady rhythm of ranch life. The children grew older, going to school in town and helping with the ranch work, and slowly becoming the people they would be. Daniel grew tall and serious like his father, with a gift for working with animals, and a quiet competence that made everyone trust him. Margaret was bright and curious, always reading and asking questions, and Zelda knew she would go far if she chose to pursue education beyond what Paso Robles could offer. James remained the wild child, but he had a good heart and a fierce loyalty to his family that made up for his impulsiveness. And Lucy, their baby, grew into a lively, talkative little girl who charmed everyone she met and had Dalton wrapped around her finger from the moment she was born. In 1897, when Daniel was 13 and starting to think about his future, Dalton sat him down and offered him a partnership in the ranch. "You are old enough to start learning the business side of things," Dalton said. "And if you want to be a rancher, you need to understand more than just cattle and horses. You need to know about markets and contracts and how to manage money. I will teach you everything I know, and when you are ready, the ranch will be yours and your siblings to run however you see fit." Daniel had looked at his father with something like awe, and Zelda had watched from the kitchen doorway with tears in her eyes. This was what they had worked for, she realized. This moment, where their son was ready to take his first steps toward becoming a man, and where Dalton was ready to share the legacy he had built. That same year, Zelda discovered she was pregnant for the 5th time. She was 39 years old, and the pregnancy was harder than the previous ones had been. She was tired all the time, and her body ached in ways it never had before. But Dalton was there every step of the way, and the children helped however they could. And in March of 1898, she gave birth to twin girls. They named them Rose Elena and Grace Maria, after the wild roses on the hills and the two women who had helped them most, Maria and Aunt Margaret. The twins were small but healthy, and they immediately wrapped the entire family around their tiny fingers. Daniel and Margaret appointed themselves unofficial guardians, and James and Lucy competed for who could make the babies smile first. The house, already full of noise and life, became even more chaotic, and Zelda loved every minute of it. By the turn of the century, the Merrick Ranch was one of the most successful in the county. Dalton had expanded the operation to include sheep as well as cattle, and had begun experimenting with new breeding techniques that produced hardier, more profitable animals. They had built a new bunkhouse for the growing number of permanent hands, and the barn had been expanded twice. The ranch now covered over 1,000 acres, and they ran a herd of nearly 800 cattle and 300 sheep. Zelda, now in her early 40s, had found a new passion in writing. She began documenting the history of Paso Robles, interviewing longtime residents and preserving their stories for future generations. Her work was eventually published in the county newspaper, and a few of her pieces were picked up by larger papers in San Francisco and Los Angeles. She also started writing a book about her experiences as a teacher and a rancher's wife, though she never quite finished it, always finding other things that needed her attention first. The children continued to grow and change. Daniel, now 16, was essentially running half the ranch himself, and Dalton relied on him more and more as his own body began to show the wear of decades of hard labor. Margaret, 14, had been accepted to a boarding school in San Francisco that specialized in preparing young women for university. And though it broke Zelda's heart to send her daughter away, she knew it was the right thing to do. Margaret was too bright to be stuck in a small town, and she needed opportunities that Paso Robles could not provide. James, 12, was still wild but had developed a surprising talent for training horses. He could gentle the most stubborn animal, and word of his skill had spread throughout the county. Lucy, now 9, had decided she wanted to be a doctor, much to everyone's surprise, and spent her time reading medical texts Zelda ordered from San Francisco and practicing bandaging on anyone who would sit still long enough. The twins, nearly 3, were a whirlwind of energy and mischief, and kept everyone on their toes. In the fall of 1901, Zelda and Dalton celebrated their 17th wedding anniversary by taking a trip to San Francisco, their first real vacation in all the years they had been married. Maria and Tomás stayed at the ranch with the children, and for one glorious week, it was just the two of them, exploring the city and eating in restaurants and sleeping late without small children climbing into their bed at dawn. "We should do this more often," Zelda said one evening as they stood on the waterfront watching the sun set over the bay. "Just the two of us, away from the ranch and the children and all the responsibilities." "We should," Dalton agreed, his arm around her waist. "Though I confess, I miss them already. The house feels too quiet without Lucy chattering and the twins getting into everything." "I know what you mean," Zelda said, laughing. "It is strange not to have someone needing me every moment of the day." They returned to the ranch refreshed and ready to dive back into the chaos of family life. Margaret came home from her boarding school for Christmas, full of stories about her studies and the city and all the things she was learning. She had grown taller and more poised, but she was still their Margaret, still the girl who loved books and teaching and making her siblings toe the line. The years from 1901 to 1905 were some of the most stable and prosperous the Merrick family had known. The ranch continued to thrive, the children grew into capable and kind young people, and Zelda and Dalton settled into the comfortable rhythm of a long and happy marriage. They still had their Sunday walks, though now they often took one or more of the children with them, and they still made time to sit on the porch in the evenings and talk about their day. Daniel left for university in the fall of 1903, choosing to study agriculture and business so he could come back to the ranch with even more knowledge and skills. Margaret was already at university by then, studying to become a teacher like her mother, and though it was hard to have two of their children so far away, Zelda and Dalton were proud beyond measure. They had given their children the education and opportunities they needed to choose their own paths, and that was worth any amount of temporary loneliness. James, now 16, had officially become the ranch's horse trainer, and his reputation had grown to the point where people from all over California were bringing their animals to him. He was making good money, and Dalton had helped him start his own savings account so he could eventually buy land and start his own operation if he wanted. Lucy, 13, was still determined to become a doctor, and Zelda was researching medical schools that might accept women, a difficult but not impossible task. The twins, now 7, were in school in town and driving their teacher, who happened to be Sarah Henderson, to distraction with their endless questions and inability to sit still. But they were good girls, kind-hearted and curious, and everyone who met them fell in love with them immediately. In March of 1906, San Francisco was struck by a devastating earthquake and fire that destroyed much of the city. Zelda and Dalton spent anxious days waiting for word from Daniel and Margaret, who were both there, and nearly collapsed with relief when telegrams arrived saying they were safe. Both children came home for the summer to recover from the shock and trauma, and the house was full again, loud and chaotic and exactly what everyone needed. That summer, as they sat around the dinner table with all 6 children home, Dalton looked at Zelda and smiled. "This is what I wanted," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "This right here, a house full of family and love and noise. Thank you for giving this to me." "We gave it to each other," Zelda said, squeezing his hand under the table. "Everything we have built, we did it together." And that was the truth of it, the core of everything they were. Two people who had found each other by accident on a September afternoon in 1883, who had taken a chance on each other when they had nothing and no one else, and who had built a life that was richer and fuller than either of them could have imagined. The years continued to roll by, each one bringing new joys and new challenges. Daniel graduated from university in 1907 and came home to take over more of the ranch operations, allowing Dalton to finally slow down and enjoy the fruits of his labor. Margaret finished her teaching degree and took a position at a school in San Luis Obispo, close enough to visit frequently but far enough to establish her independence. James bought 20 acres adjacent to the ranch and started his own horse training operation, with Dalton's blessing and financial help. Lucy was accepted to a medical program in Los Angeles, one of the few that would take female students, and she left in the fall of 1910 with Zelda's blessings and Dalton's worried admonitions to be careful. The twins, Rose and Grace, were 12 now and inseparable. They had developed a passion for music, and Zelda had arranged for a music teacher from San Luis Obispo to come to the ranch once a week to teach them piano and voice. The house was often filled with their singing and laughter, and Dalton would sit in his chair by the fire and listen with a contented smile on his face. In 1912, on their 28th wedding anniversary, Zelda and Dalton took another trip to San Francisco, which had been rebuilt and was as vibrant as ever. They visited Daniel, who had come up for a cattlemen's convention, and Margaret, who had moved back to the city to teach at a prestigious girls' academy. They stayed in a fine hotel and ate in fancy restaurants and marveled at how much the world had changed since they first met. "Do you ever regret it?" Dalton asked one evening as they walked along the waterfront. "Staying in Paso Robles, marrying me, living a life so different from what you trained for." Zelda stopped and turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "Not for one single moment," she said firmly. "Everything I have, everything I am, is because of you and the choice we made together. I would not change a thing, Dalton. Not one thing." He kissed her then, there on the waterfront with people passing by and the city lights glittering around them. And Zelda felt the same rush of love and joy she had felt the first time he kissed her nearly 30 years before. They returned to the ranch to find that Lucy had come home for a surprise visit, and the house was once again full of children, though they were hardly children anymore. Daniel was nearly 28, engaged to a lovely young woman named Catherine whom he had met at university. Margaret was 26 and being courted by a history professor at her school. James was 24 and had just bought more land to expand his operation. Lucy was 21 and in her final year of medical school, already planning to return to Paso Robles to open a practice when she graduated. And the twins were 14, beautiful and talented and on the verge of young womanhood. How did this happen? Zelda asked Dalton one night after the children had all gone to bed. They were sitting on the porch of the big house, wrapped in blankets against the cool spring air, watching the stars. "How did we get from that day at the depot to this? 6 children, 3 grandchildren on the way, a thriving ranch, a life beyond anything I dreamed possible, one day at a time," Dalton said simply. "One choice at a time. I chose to stop and help you. You chose to trust me. We chose to love each other and build something together, and here we are." "Here we are," Zelda echoed, leaning her head on his shoulder. She was 54 years old, her hair was streaked with gray, and her body ached in the mornings from decades of hard work. But she had never been happier. She had a husband who loved her, children who made her proud, and a life full of purpose and meaning. She had started out waiting for a train that never came, stranded and alone in a strange town. And she had ended up with everything she had ever wanted, offered to her by a cowboy with a wagon and a wedding ring, and a heart big enough to hold all the love she had to give. Daniel married Catherine in the summer of 1913, and Zelda gained the daughter-in-law she had always hoped for. Catherine was smart and kind and genuinely loved the ranch, and she fit into the family like she had always been there. Their first child, a boy they named Dalton Thomas after his grandfather, was born in the spring of 1914, and Zelda held her first grandchild in her arms and cried tears of pure joy. Margaret married her professor, a kind man named Robert Sullivan, in the fall of 1914, and they settled in San Francisco where he taught, and she continued her work at the academy. James married a local girl named Anna Peterson in 1915, and they built a house on his property and started their own family. Lucy graduated from medical school and returned to Paso Robles as promised, opening a practice in town that quickly became indispensable to the community. The twins, Rose and Grace, both showed an interest in teaching, and Zelda knew that legacy would continue through them. They attended the local teachers' college in San Luis Obispo, taking the train back and forth, and spent their weekends helping with the younger students in town. By 1918, Dalton was 60 years old and officially retired from ranching, though he still spent hours every day walking the property and checking on the cattle and offering advice to Daniel, who now ran the operation. Zelda was 59 and had taken up painting, creating beautiful landscapes of the hills and valleys that had been her home for 35 years. They had 11 grandchildren by then, with more on the way, and the ranch house was always full of children and noise and life. Sunday dinners became a tradition, with all the children and grandchildren who could make it gathering around the massive table Daniel had built, sharing food and stories and laughter. "This is what I always wanted," Dalton said one Sunday evening after everyone had left and it was just him and Zelda again. "A big family, a legacy to leave behind, a life well lived. You gave me all of that, Zelda." "We gave it to each other," Zelda said, as she always did, because it was true. Everything they had built together, from that first day when he had stopped his wagon at a closed depot and offered help to a stranger. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and occasional sorrows. Tomás passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1920, and Maria joined him 2 years later. Zelda and Dalton mourned them both deeply, grateful for the decades of friendship and loyalty they had given. They were buried on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the valley they had loved. In 1923, Zelda and Dalton celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with a party that drew half the county. All 6 of their children were there, along with their spouses and children, and the house and yard were packed with people who had come to honor a couple who had become legends in their own time. The story of how they had met, of the closed depot and the cowboy who had offered his wagon and a wedding ring, had been told and retold so many times it had taken on the quality of myth. But Zelda and Dalton knew the truth. It had not been myth or fate or destiny. It had been choice, pure and simple. He had chosen to stop. She had chosen to trust him. They had chosen to love each other, to stay together through hard times and good, to build a family and a life that honored the best in both of them. And that choice, made and remade every day for 40 years, was what had brought them here, to this moment, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, standing together on the land they loved. "Thank you," Dalton said quietly as they stood on the porch watching the party wind down, "for everything. For saying yes when I asked you to marry me, for staying when things got hard, for loving me even when I did not deserve it." "You always deserved it," Zelda said, tears streaming down her face. "From the very first moment I saw you pull that wagon up to the depot, you deserved it. You are the best man I have ever known, Dalton Merrick, and I would choose you again and again in every life and every world. I love you." "I love you too," Dalton said, and kissed her as the sun set over the hills they had walked together for 4 decades. They lived for many more years, growing old together with grace and humor and a deep, abiding love that never faded. Dalton passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1932 at the age of 74, with Zelda holding his hand. She mourned him deeply, but also with gratitude for the life they had shared. She lived for 8 more years, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who loved her, before joining him in 1940 at the age of 79. They were buried side by side on the hill they had chosen together all those years ago, under a live oak tree with a view that stretched forever. The headstone was simple: Dalton Thomas Merrick, 1858–1932, and Zelda Marie Merrick, 1861–1940, together forever. But the true memorial to their love was not a stone marker. It was the ranch that still thrived under Daniel's management and would pass to his children and grandchildren. It was the school in town where Margaret's daughter now taught, continuing the legacy of education Zelda had started. It was the medical practice Lucy had built, now taken over by her son. It was the dozens of descendants who carried their names and their values forward into the world. It was the story, told and retold, of a woman stranded at a closed depot and a cowboy who offered his wagon and a wedding ring and a lifetime of love. That was the legacy of Dalton and Zelda Merrick. Not wealth or fame or great deeds, but love, freely given and faithfully kept, from that September afternoon in 1883 until their last breaths. They had started with nothing but hope and determination, and a chance encounter that changed both their lives. And they had ended with everything that mattered: family, legacy, love, and the knowledge that they had lived well and truly together.